Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Naruto was in Attack on Titan. Humanity, weak. Strong. Loving. Loathing. Kind. Cruel. Loyal. Disloyal. They can be all these things and more, and yet, in the face of great adversity, when faced with insurmountable odds, they have managed to overcome and triumph time and time again. But even with a newfound ally on their side, do they stand any chance against the Titans? After all, he's only human. Before we start, kindly like and subscribe to this channel and look over the description box for the author of this amazing storyline. Welcome aboard! Chapter 1, Prologue, Savior. Humanity. Weak. Strong. Loving. Loathing. Kind. Cruel. Loyal. Disloyal. They can be all these things and more, and yet, in the face of great adversity, when faced with insurmountable odds, they have managed to overcome all and triumph, time and time again. Be it strength through numbers or solidarity, they have always proven their mettle. Always ascertained their worth and existence. The greater the difficulty, the more glory in surmounting it completely. Skillful pilots gain their reputation from storms and tempests, seasoned warriors garner fame from impossible victories. But no warrior or pilot, nor even the greatest minds the world had to offer, could have predicted the rise of the Titans. No one could have foreseen the walls humanity would build around itself to keep these terrible Titans away, and the terrible complacency that would ensure. 100 years of peace shattered by their subsequent return after so many years. None could have known what was coming. None could have known that the enemy did have a weakness, one that could be exploited, albeit at great risk. Nor could anyone have prophesied the coming of one who just might be able to wipe all of Titan kind from the face of the earth. Mikasa Ackerman ran, as hard and as fast as her legs would carry her, chest heaving and hitching for breath, sobs tearing at her throat, tears scouring her eyes raw and red. Her long black hair kept getting in her eyes when she ran, but she daren't stop to bind it up for fear of being discovered. All around her, Shiganshina District, a town of the outermost wall, Maria, was in chaos. Because that wall had been breached. Everyone was being slaughtered, eaten, devoured. And they, as humans as people, were all but helpless to prevent it. There were simply too many. All around her, the town burned. She didn't care. The death of her adoptive mother, Eren's mother, was all too fresh in her mind, blotting out all else. Devoured by that Titan, her body bitten in half, swallowed in a single gulp. She tried to keep it together. She really had. But she'd just been so frightened. So scared. And so she had run. Run, until she and Eren somehow got separated from the others in the chaos, from everyone else that might have been able to protect him. They were only 9. There was no way they could possibly fight against any of these monsters. There was just no way. Boom. Heart-pounding, Mikasa dared to risk a glance over her shoulder, eyes wide. A Titan stood there in the distance, towering over a nearby building, eyes narrow, its mouth gaping wide. Beside her, Eren gasped, mirroring her thought. Had it seen them? It had. Slowly, then with ever-increasing frequency, it started to pound after them, the earth shaking with each step. Still Mikasa ran, and Eren alongside her, knowing they couldn't possibly outrun this monster, and yet knowing they must. Live. Eren's words from long ago echoed in her mind, telling her to run, demanding that she run, that she escapes. Then she stumbled and fell, her foot catching upon a cobblestone, sending her skittering into Eren, sending them both sprawling. The impact must have knocked him out. He must have struck his head because her adopted sibling didn't move after that. But Mikasa had no time for such thoughts, because the Titan was nearly upon them now, its footfalls growing closer with each step, its giant fingers splayed wide. Time itself seemed to slow. In a motion that seemed to last several minutes rather than a single second, a black and orange blur descended upon the Titan's unprotected backside and swarmed up its hide. A man? Twin knives kunai glittered in his hands, their purpose obvious, their deadly edges singing a song of death as their owner seemingly ran up the slippery slope that was the Titan's back before leaping upon its shoulder. Recognizing the sudden weights on its back, the behemoth began to turn, but it was already too late. The man reversed his grip on the daggers and struck. Twin knives plunged into supple flesh, once, twice, 3 times. The assailant struck down without brutal precision, slashing across the beast's only vulnerable spot in a series of brutal crosscuts that left the Titan reeling, clutching at the gaping wounds, the one area it had forgotten to protect. Neck. Looking back, everything only appeared to be moving slowly. In reality, the man had struck 7 times in less than a single second, faster than the human eye could comprehend. And yet Mikasa, with adrenaline surging through her young veins, had seen it all. She saw him kick off the Titan's shoulder and launch backwards, his body contorting in a flawless flip. He wasn't wearing motion gear. But that was absurd. He'd taken down the Titan with only a pair of knives. Impossible. Ridiculous, even. There was just no way he could have. Oh. Mikasa's mind went blank as the Titan's corpse teetered, rocking back and forth on its heels, as though it couldn't decide which began to fall. Its jaws still hung open, as though determined to devour her in its last seconds of life. She knew she should run, that she ought to flee from this place before she was eaten and meet up with Eren, but her mind was inexplicably filled with fear as she looked into the hate-filled eyes of her would-be killer. Just then, she caught sight of that strange blur in her peripherals again. Get down! Her knees scraped against the ground as her body rolled and tumbled across the cobblestones, sending a hot flash of pain through her legs. Pain. That meant she was alive, then. That she hadn't been eaten. Her mind was only just now catching up with what she'd seen, her brain processing the impossible death of the 15-meter beast. Gradually she became aware of arms wrapped around her, a body shielding her from harm. He let go of her then, and she scrambled backwards, her mind a whirl. What was happening? How was she still alive? Why was she covered in blood? Where was? Easy there, lass. A rough voice soothed her thoughts. You've had a nasty fall. Slowly, warily Mikasa craned her neck upwards, turning her head in the direction of her savior. He was young, Mikasa was certain of that much. Couldn't have been more than 17 years old, maybe 18 at the most. Ragged blonde locks shaded his whiskered face, concealing bright, sapphire eyes and an overly gracious smile deep beneath his bangs. And yet his eyes seemed old, somehow jaded. Hollow, even. An old, traveling cloak hung over his shoulders, beneath which the ruined remnants of an old black and orange jumpsuit could be seen, wafting in the breeze summoned by his arrival in the courtyard. And he was covered in Titan blood. It stemmed from his sternum and shoulders like a fine mist, and thankfully there was none upon his face, but still. He must have finally seen the fear in her eyes, because he began to clean himself with his cloak. Only then did she notice Eren, slung over his shoulder. Finally, when their rescuer seemed certain there was no longer any blood on his personage, he bent to a knee and faced her, unshouldering her sibling. When he turned, the light of the setting sun glinted of the metal plate wrapped around his head. It was a headband, worn by many of his kind, but Mikasa didn't know that. Not yet. So instead, she held her breath and braced for the worst. Imagine her surprise when he nodded, checked his pulse and sighed. He'll be fine, were the first words she heard out of his mouth. Then he turned his attentions upon her. Are you all right? He asked. Trembling, Mikasa managed a nod. No need to act tough, he observed with a small smile. What's your name? Mikasa. Mikasa? The man's smile grew another inch. That's a nice name. Mine's Naruto. Nice to meet ya. His gaze shifted to Eren's slumbering form. And this is? Eren. Your brother. It was not a question. Hi. Mikasa could feel an icy calm settling over herself, her fear replaced by a cold certainty. You killed that Titan back there, didn't you? Titan. His face crumpled. So that's what they're called? He hazarded a look at the still steaming corpse. There were a ton of them out there, so is that why you have all these walls? To keep these things out? He indicated the still standing perimeter of stone that surrounded the city, a wall that had protected them for many years. For all the good it had done them thanks to the colossal Titan. Everyone was dying because of that brutal beast and its mindless machinations, because it had let those other Titans in. Then his words stabbed at Mikasa's psyche, penetrating her cold fury. Out there? She blinked, curious, despite her ire. He wasn't from beyond the wall, was he? Did you come from outside? Well, I certainly don't live in here. Naruto flung a hand for the destruction surrounding them. A knife fell from his sleeve and clattered to the floor at her feet with a clang of steel. It was one of the very same knives he'd used to butcher the Titan with before. Mikasa grabbed it almost on instinct. You dropped this. She offered, handing it to him. Oh, that? The blonde laughed at that. It was a soft, amusing sound. She rather liked it. You can keep it. I have plenty of M. And on that note. Without pausing to even glance over his shoulder, he flung a kunai backwards. The kunai simply materialized in his hand, flung and thrown before Mikasa even recognized the weapon. Before she could think to ask just what he was doing, Naruto did something with his fingers and suddenly there were more of them. Many, many more. She was about to say he'd wasted his weapons when a massive Titan lumbered into view, stumbling right into his line of fire. It staggered as the kunai struck it in the back of the head, blinked, turned its gaping maw. Katsu. Naruto whispered as he crouched over Eren and Mikasa, making a fist with his right hand. Bakram. Mikasa felt, rather than saw the actual explosion. Everything shook around her, threatening to throw her from her feet, were it not for Naruto. The blonde's body was the sole shield against the fire and flames that rose up to swallow them whole, leaving the inferno to ripple harmlessly around them. When the smoke finally cleared, they were covered in soot and silt but still very much alive and for the most part, unharmed. At least the unconscious Eren and Mikasa were. Naruto, however. Ah, Kami, these are gonna leave a mark. Mikasa barely stifled a scream when she saw the ruined state of the blonde's back, shards of sharp stone wedged between flesh and bone. His visage was set in a tight grimace as he stood. With a grunt he reached down and began pulling the deadly spikes out of his back one by one, seemingly uncaring for his own gaping wounds. Ow, ow, ow. Naruto was hissing by the time he pulled the last stone spear from his spine. That's what I get for using so many explosive tags. When Mikasa tried to get a better look at his injury, she lost her breath. In place of what she'd thought to be gaping wounds, there were now only the slightest of cuts, and even as she looked on, those two began to heal as though they'd never been. The only proof that they'd ever existed were the gaping holes in his cloak, and she half expected those to vanish as well. This was all so surreal. Stop gawping. Naruto thumbed her mouth shut. It's rude. You act like you've never seen a Jinchuriki before. Mikasa hadn't. She didn't even know what a Jinchuriki was. Another explosion of cannon fire lit the city square before she could speak, showering them in smoke. Naruto frowned. Let's get you and your brother out of here, Misaka-chan, he decided. I'd hate to have you get eaten after going through all this. Without breaking stride, Naruto bent down and scooped her and Eren up into his arms, pulling them tight to his chest. Hold tight now. That chest alongside the entirety of his body was abruptly engulfed in a strange golden glow, stemming from head to toe. Their rescuer grunted a warning, and then the world fell away from the three of them. Indeed, the landscape itself seemed to blur in and out around them. It took Mikasa several seconds to realize her eyes weren't playing tricks on her. Naruto was simply running at an insane rate of speed. Fast. This was Mikasa's only thought before the air was subsequently sucked from her lungs, leaving her gasping for breath. It came back to her in short order only to be taken away yet again at the sight unveiling before her young eyes. Because Naruto was running. Leaping. leaping, catapulting them forward. It didn't seem possible that a human being could move so swiftly, yet here he was, vaulting over buildings as though they were not but pebbles in his path. They swept past hundreds of titans in the span of several seconds, blurring by them before the behemoths could even think to reach out and pluck their prey from the rooftops. In some cases, Naruto simply barreled right through the enemies, his golden cloak serving as an impenetrable barrier, an almighty shield that thrust towering titans aside whenever one of them dared to bear their path. At other times his cloak sprouted arms and appendage which he used to vault over the cruel creatures, ending their lives in the blink of an eye. Out of the corner of her eye she couldn't quite see what with her Naruto blocking her vision, but she was fairly certain made another strange gesture with his hands, crossing both fingers before him even as he held them with his arms. And as Mikasa Ackerman looked on, she bore witness to yet another miracle. Out of the air, appearing from nothingness, were dozens of Narutos, 24 in number. But how was that possible? He'd simply made more of himself. If Naruto noticed her confusion, he said nothing. Instead, he barked orders at his clones. There could be no other word for them, issuing commands in the blink of an eye. Some he dispatched to aid in the evacuations, others were sent to exterminate the titans. The remaining 7 gathered around them in a protective phalanx, their golden bodies a shield against whatever dared come their way. They advanced more slowly now, the shinobi's agility was just a memory now compared to their current pace. Mikasa continued to look on, unable to give voice to the sudden swell of emotion surging in her chest. Why, was this stranger saving them? What did he possibly hope to gain from their safety? And why did her face feel so hot? Thankfully, Eren chose that moment to stir, forcing the thought to be broken. Era? Naruto skidded to a halt, the sudden momentum of which nearly jarred the 2 children from his arms. You awake, Gaki? Eren muttered something incomprehensible, to which Naruto frowned. Come again? Don wanna wakupiat. Naruto's response was to strike him over the head with an open palm. Oi, Kozo. Speak properly so I can hear you. It wasn't a hard blow by any means, but it was more than enough to return her brother to the world of the waking. Eren jerked free of Naruto's grasp and flopped to the street, clutching the rising welt upon his head. If the situation hadn't been so dire, Mikasa might have found it funny. As it were, she continued to watch the conflict unfold from Naruto's grasp. It simply hadn't occurred to her to ask to be put down yet, that was all. It had nothing to do with wanting to be held. Itai! He yelped, glaring bloody red daggers at the blonde. What was that for? To knock some sense into you. Naruto's deadpan was barely concealed. Can you walk? Good. Without further ado he began to usher her brother along ahead of them. This way, this way. He ushered them under the gate, ignoring the confused glances of the military as the portcullis ponderously edged ever closer to closing. An errant glance caused the clones to slow, then stop altogether. Much to Mikasa's disbelief, the doppelgangers moved to stand shoulder to shoulder with the men and women, the last line of defense against the oncoming titans. Mikasa murmured her thanks as he finally lowered her to the ground and ushered her onward after Eren. They were nearly there, edging past the guards, almost to safety. Good evening, gentlemen. Naruto inclined his head politely as he stepped inside the arch. It's a fine day to die, isn't it? Who are you? One of them challenged him, reaching for their blade. Ally or enemy? Me? The blonde tilted his head aside. HRM. I guess you could call me a friend. He made as if to move past them, uncaring of the hostile gazes fixated upon his back. Abruptly, he paused. Why aren't you out there? He asked one of the guards. Ha! I said, why aren't you out there? Naruto continued. Isn't it your job to protect these people? The men shrank back from his gaze. Because it's safer here. Someone murmured. It was like flicking a switch. Like an iron trap, Naruto's gaze locked onto the man's own, stifling all warmth in the air. The sheer intensity of his stare, the sudden ice in his expression was enough to silence the entire room. Nothing moved. Nothing at all. And then he spoke, voice black as pitch, eyes cold as the coldest winter. "Tell that," he growled, "to the children dying in these walls." Without another word he continued onward, leading them out of the darkness of the arch and into the light. Despite her best efforts to remain calm, Mikasa started at the sight. She could see the boats. She could even see Armin on one of them. But they were too far away, much too far, and at this rate. "Alrighty then." Naruto grunted, hoisting her up by the scruff of the neck and into the air. An errant glance confirmed he had done the same with Eren. 1 for the money, 2 for the show, 3 to get ready. Mikasa blanched. Naruto, he couldn't possibly be planning on. And here we go. He was. 2 more. Naruto bellowed, and before Mikasa could think to protest, he flung her and Eren hard. They'd just enough time to see the river blur beneath them before they struck the hard, unyielding decks of the boat, landing in a tangle of arms and limbs. A cry of surprise went up from her brother. He hadn't been expecting this. Neither had she. Armin was suddenly there beside them, quick to help them to their feet even as Mikasa struggled to get her bearings. "You made it!" he exclaimed. "Yeah," Eren replied sullenly. Mikasa sympathized. Now that the chaos was behind them, she truly had time to think about it, the death of their mother. It pressed down on her like a weight now, a heavy burden, harsh and cruel, threatening to obliterate all thought. All save one. Naruto? Over here. Clambering to her feet, she scanned the many faces crammed into the boat, half expecting to see Naruto amongst them. But the blonde's whiskered face was nowhere to be seen. In fact, his voice had sounded incredibly distant just now. Eren was likewise searching for the blonde, but for different reasons than Mikasa's own. Where the hell was that bastard? How dare he throw them like that in dispensary? He owed him a kick to the shin. Naruto. Mikasa called once, expecting him to pop up at any moment. But he did not. "Isn't that him?" Armin pointed out. Mikasa wanted to ask just how her friend knew Naruto, but that train of thought found itself obliterated seconds later. Imagine her surprise when she finally caught sight of Naruto in the distance, standing on the shore. He stood there, tall and proud, refusing to turn his back, but at the same time, making no move to distance himself from the growing chaos behind him. Wait a minute? Wasn't he getting on the boats? If he didn't hurry, he'd be left behind. "Sorry, this is where we part ways." He waved back at them with a kindly smile. "It's been fun." He craned his head and looked away. That kind smile and those tattered rags did nothing to distract her from what came next, however. The wall burst, as if he'd expected it to, and a massive titan came barreling through. Unlike its other brethren, its body was sheathed in armor from head to toe. And it was coming closer. Pounding forth in a rising cloud of debris of steam, it showed absolutely no sign of stopping, nay, it would not stop. And Naruto stood right in its path. Mikasa marveled at him as he doked a bracing stance, spreading his legs apart, sandaled feet burrowing into the concrete. And then it happened. She felt a change in the air. Had she been closer, she might have seen his eyes narrow into the golden slits and orange eyelids that so defined his favorite technique. Sage mode. Without pause or preamble, he raised a hand, palm upright. There was nothing significant of the gesture, no massive exuding of power. He simply extended his right arm, held it there. And the armored titan found itself stopped in its tracks. Cold. Naruto budged not an inch, though the street burst beneath their feet and showered them in debris. Though the massive monstrosity strained and snorted at him, his body stood strong and all too still, an immutable pillar that refused to move or bend to his opponent's will. Oi. His voice rose over the chaos, growing louder with each passing second. Killing innocent people, butchering little children, just what the hell, do you guys? The blonde raised his gaze then, and even from here, Mikasa realized something was wrong. Think you're doing? With a colossal heave, her savior grabbed the titan and heaved, flinging the behemoth over his shoulder as though it weighed no more than a child. The vicious judo throw served its purpose. Naruto's sudden counter sent the armored titan crashing to the ground, well away from what had once been the gate. The survivors screamed at the sight, scrambling away from the clash even as the titan struggled back to its feet. Naruto was there, rising in the air to greet it. A single punch sent his adversary careening back towards the gate in a shower of stone. How had he done that, Mikasa wondered. He'd done something no man should be capable of, a feat impossible for a mere mortal. He'd knocked a titan back with his bare hands? Aura! Aura! At the sound of Naruto's scream, Mikasa's head snapped back and forth like a puppet severed from its strings. Naruto! Yash, the blonde murmured, bracing himself for the worst as his opponent dug itself out of the rubble. Let's do this, Kurama. Not at full size, though. Don't want to crush everything. Golden light engulfed him as before, but this time it didn't stop there. It shot upward and outward from him like a beacon, blanketing the setting sun in 7 different shades of crimson and saffron. Mikasa looked on helplessly, awed as the blinding radiance took hold of the blonde's form and shook it, warping his body into something massive. Something monstrous. Sapphire snapped into scarlet. Fangs grew where there had once been teeth, spreading his visage into the muzzle of a beast. Hair changed into golden fur and grew rapidly cover his skin, leaving him to droop onto all fours. 9 tails of pure, nascent energy sprouted from his back and flayed the earth to ribbons. Claws dug deep into the soil and ripped up great gouts of earth, flinging chunks of it into the air, one of which reduced an unlucky man to a mere stain upon the land. All the while Naruto was growing, changing, until he towered over them, so much like the armored titan itself. Mikasa gawped up at it, this beast that had once been a man. Was this really Naruto? How had he become such a beast? How had he gone from a mere man to something so monstrous? Ryo-warg. The fox, for it could be nothing else, opened its mighty maw and roared, an ear-splitting cry that shook both heaven and earth. Not one to be outdone, the armored titan answered the fox's cry with another of its own, a deafening knell rising up beneath his, causing everyone to clench their ears in a vain attempt to stifle the sound. Unaffected by the blast, the beast that Naruto had become rose, standing on its haunches to appraise its armored adversary. Row upon row of razor-sharp teeth splitting in an eerie grin. Hello, dinner. It snarled. There was a moment of stern silence as they beheld one another. And then the fox pounced. One moment it stood stationary upon the soils of the land, the next, it erupted upward with a mighty lunge of its hindquarters, rising to tackle the titan up and into the hole through which it had first emerged. The earth groaned beneath their impact, sending guards scattering from their cover, uncertain as of whom to attack. Both monstrosities were up in an instant, and it was then that Mikasa realized just how much at a disadvantage Naruto's bijou form truly was. Although he was clearly much more nimble than his larger adversary, he lacked the armored platings and the endurance that marked his opponent. He seemed to realize this even as she thought of it and bounded forward again, swarming his opponent before it could break into another bone-jarring charge. It all happened so fast. One moment they were rolling around on the ground, clawing and tearing at one another. The next, the fox's fangs finally found purchase upon the titan's right arm, biting down with enough force to shear clear through the armor and muscle to the bone beneath. And then it was over. Mikasa recognized the sick pop of dislocation, and then the monster's arm was simply gone, flopping away from them in a shower of gore. The titan spat something unintelligible at him, its eyes wide with anger, and perhaps a touch of fear. They circled one another, titan and fox, fangs bared, neither willing to make the next move. In the end, the Jinchuriki did. Naruto/Kurama kanonied forward, slamming into the titan like a freight train. There came a mighty oomph as the monster's armored spine slammed into the west wall, leaving it stunned, but not out of the fight by any means. It could still recover and continue. Naruto didn't give it those means. Even as his armored adversary struggled to right itself, his fox-like form was already there, looming overhead like a fierce, implacable kami come to wreak righteous judgment. Despite its own fear, his opponent puffed out its chest and roared. Grarar! The titan never finished that roar. Jaws of pure, coalescent energy closed around the beast's neck and proceeded to shake it like a ragdoll. The armor upon its neck began to boil and crack, splintering away beneath those man-sized teeth. It seemed to recognize its own impending doom, the titan did, because its remaining arm struck at the kitsune time and time again, armored knuckles stabbing into the fox's unprotected snout until finally, Naruto was forced to let go, lest he risk the breaking of his own nose. Yelping, he seemed to retreat, momentarily cowed by his opponent's strength. The armored titan chose its moment to advance, and the beast that Naruto had become loosed a roar of his defiance, presenting the giant with a terrible view of the rising tide of black fire in the back of its throat. To its credit, the titan tried to draw back from the blast. It really did. Naruto simply wasn't having any of it. 9 tails coiled around the beast's remaining arms and legs, drawing it forward, holding it fast. 4 paws clamped around its torso, and still the Baijidama swelled larger in the back of the blonde's throat. Incredibly, he locked eyes with Mikasa in that moment before he unleashed hell upon the titan and himself. She could see the other titans crowding in and around him, grasping at his body, at his form, but despite that the kitsune held fast. Despite the titans tearing at its fur and devouring its flesh, the kitsune smiled. A voice plucked at her thoughts, whispered into her mind. See ya around, Mikasa-chan. And then, he was gone into the fire. Her last sight of him was that of the explosion. It consumed both kitsune and titan alike, the sheer shockwave of which rocked the boat even as it rounded the bend and left what had once been their home far behind. Eren watched it go with tears in his eyes, still lost in the memory of his dearly departed mother. Damn those titans. He hated them. Hated them. Why did they have to ruin everything like that, devour everyone for the sheer pleasure of it? He'd get them. One day, he would kill them all. I swear, I'll annihilate all of them. His sister's thoughts dwelt on a different subject as their home drifted further and further out of sight. A touch of sorrow plucked at her heart. Naruto was dead. Had to be. There was no way anything, titanic or otherwise, could have survived a blast of such proportions. Even now she could see the flames roiling high into the distance. Naruto was gone. And even if he wasn't, he was trapped in a city surrounded by titans. There were no ways he, even with all his formidable skills, could survive. Yes, he was probably dead. Just like her mother. Just like. Silent and bereft, she laid her head down upon the deck, uncaring of the hardwood floor. Despite her grief, sleep came quickly, ensorcelling her in the sweet mire of her dreams. She dreamed of happier times, of a time before the titans, when she thought the world was a kind and gentle place. And so Mikasa Ackerman slept and she slumbered, quietly wondering at the young man's fate. Unknowing that she'd soon see him again. Chapter 2, Potential. 3 years have passed since that fateful day. Eren applied for military training that year, as did Mikasa and Armin. Each expected hard times ahead for the next 3 years. What they weren't expecting was to meet an old friend. At least Mikasa wasn't. Now more than 13 years of age, she stood stock-still with her brother and childhood friend row for row in uniform, rigid and unflinching as their instructor welcomed them in typical military fashion. You are now officially members of the training unit number 104. Said instructor, a dark-eyed, intimidating man, barked at them. Unfortunately for you, I, Keith Shardis, will be in charge of you maggots starting today. As will my lieutenant, Uzumaki Naruto. The only indication of this lieutenant was a slight nod to an adjacent rise on the nearby mesa. Mikasa jumped at the mention of that name, but when she turned to look, no one was standing there. Had she just imagined hearing his name, then? Inexorably, the instructor continued. We aren't here to give you a warm welcome. All of you are now merely livestock, waiting to be eaten by titans. No. You're even worse than livestock. For the next 3 years, we'll train you useless shits. We'll teach you how to fight the Titans. When you face one in 3 years, will you still be just food? Or, will you become a glorious wall to protect these walls? Or a mighty champion of mankind who will destroy the Titans? That is for you to decide. The choice lies in your hands. Without another word he strode forward to address his recruits. You there? Yes, sir. Who the hell are you? He demanded of Armin. I'm Armin Arlert, sir. The boy replied without fail. I'm from Shiganshina, sir. Sure, you are. Shotties roared back. Good name for a retard. Your parents call you that? My grandfather, sir. Arlert, why are you here? To contribute to mankind's victory, sir. Fucking splendid. The instructor declared, seizing Armin by the shoulders and spun him about. You'll make fine Titan feed. Line 3. About face. With that, he moved on to the next line. And who the hell are you? He asked of the next recruit. Sir. I'm Thomas Wagner, sir. I'm from Trost, sir. Speak up. I'm Thomas Wagner, SI. Can't hear you. Come back after your balls drop. Without pause or preamble, he moved on to the next group. Line 4. About turn. A whiskered visage pulled the slightest of smiles as it watched the instructor move on to the next line of recruits and continued his verbal assault. Uzumaki Naruto almost laughed at the sight. He had high hopes for this generation. There was so much raw potential here. Some of them would make fine soldiers, others might become fine scouts, and still others showed the inherent talent to become shinobi. Indeed, Naruto had held high hopes for these youngsters. High hopes indeed. 3 long years had passed since his return to the walls. Having survived his scuffle with the Titans, he'd followed the river and eventually found his way to civilization, making for himself a defunct home here amidst the denizens of Wall Rose. Word of his heroism in Shiganshina had spread like wildfire amongst mankind. He'd become something of a man-made legend to these people now. A man who could take on the form of a giant kitsune, create copies of himself and summon the wind with a flick of his fingers. Some said he was a god and worshipped him as such. Others called him a devil and feared him even more than the scourge that plagued their very race. God and devil. Naruto considered himself to be neither. He was, after all, only human. Ah, the irony of that statement. Were it not for the demon within him, he'd never have survived being catapulted to this godforsaken future, never have awoken to find these detestable giants. After all, he thought to himself, I'm only human. And this human had come all this way just to see these greenhorns. With his powers and prestige, he could have easily landed a cushy position protecting the king or serving some other human noble. Instead, he'd chosen to take the bull by the horns literally and figuratively. Less than a week from now he would be an unofficial part of the Scouting Legion. He had no idea how to use the 3D maneuver gear. No, he refused to use it, and yet, for reasons unbeknownst to himself now, he wanted to work with them, these fools who dared to venture beyond the walls to fight the Titans. He'd even turned down the Garrison Corps and the military police just so he could join said fools in their fight. But that was neither here nor there. Right now, and for the next 3 years, he would help train these whelps, or die trying. He might even make a shinobi out of 1 or 2 of them, if they had the right aptitude and assuming they had the proper chakra coils to activate. Who knows, given enough time and the right resources, he might be able to recreate his people from scratch. Then he wouldn't be alone anymore. Whoa there, tiger. Naruto slapped his cheeks before he became too caught up in his dreams for the future. Agelessness aside, he had all the time in the world. Some of them, the recruits below him, might not even make it through the week. Still, to think he'd find himself here, staring down at all these fresh young faces, this was so nostalgic. It reminded him of his early shinobi days. Before the threat of war loomed on the horizon, before Sasuke's defection, before Orochimaru, before all of that. Back when he was so desperate to become a ninja, so proud to wear the Hishiate. It almost brought a tear to his eye. Most of these children had no idea what lay in store for them, no idea of the horror a Titan could inspire, and yet they were throwing themselves in to become soldiers anyway. That set them in one of two groups. Ridiculously brave, or hopelessly stupid. In the case of the former, he could work with them, but if they were the latter, as he secretly suspected. Che. He thought to himself. Listen to yourself, Naruto. You're being sentimental again. These kids can't stand up to a Titan as they are now. Certainly not the one you fought. You mean the armored Titan? Been a while, Kurama. He chortled to himself. Did you enjoy your 3-year nap? HRMPH. The kitsune yawned. Maybe if you'd done something interesting, I would have woken up sooner. Naruto cocked his head aside, smiling at the word reverberating inside his head. Now, most would have considered him crazy for talking to himself. But he wasn't crazy. Okay, maybe a little. But that didn't make the voice inside his head any less real. Kurama, the nine-tailed fox, was as much a part of him as he was it. Ever since he'd unlocked the seal deep within him, they'd ceased to be two separate entities. Now, they were one. Dual souls sharing a single body, two spirits, in one flesh, sharing the same chakra. Apparently eternal youth was a side effect of their union. That, or they looked ridiculously good for 117 years. Their dirt nap must have done wonders. Youthfulness aside, do you really think that Giant is here, somewhere? He's here all right. Naruto replied, narrowing his gaze upon the population at their feet. I can smell him. And, at least 2 others. It was true. Just had to be. He diligently spent the last 3 years, after the breach of Maria, hunting down titans. Sharpening not just his killing skill. Sleeping for a century tended to make one a bit rusty, but his sensory capabilities as well. And his nose told him that the armored behemoth was somewhere within these walls, possibly even amongst these recruits, but so far he had yet to see hide nor hair of him. Do you have any idea what you're suggesting? A Titan shifter? The last shinobi shrugged. It's possible, I guess. I mean, we gained that ability 3 years ago, didn't we? And you know how much I hated you using it. His partner chastised. You went completely berserk last time. No use lying there. It must have had something to do with ingesting all that Titan blood during their battle. He discovered the ability purely by accident, having been without food for nearly a week, forced to wander by the river, pissed off and angry at himself, wanting more than anything to just find something to eat. Something. Anything. Somehow or another he tripped and stumbled, his hand catching upon a jagged piece of rock, and sliced his thumb open. Just like that, he transformed, morphing into the very creatures he'd been hunting. Thankfully he hadn't been anywhere near Wall Rose at the time. His memories of the incident were still hazy, but Kurama's remained crystal clear. His body had gone from man to monster, shifting into a 20-meter monstrosity more than 5 meters larger than those 15-meter titans. If anyone saw him like that, they'd have freaked out. In the end he'd devoured an entire pack of wolves before Kurama had finally been able to wrest himself out of their temporarily rampaging body and stop him. Naruto shivered at the thought. He had no desire to ever revisit that form again. Not unless he absolutely had to. Unless he was forced to face the colossal Titan. Ugh. There was a battle he didn't relish fighting. He was confident he could control this newfound power of his if he set his mind to it, but at the same time, he was afraid of losing himself to that form again. If that ever happened, there would be no holding back. He hadn't used his full power during the breach of Wall Maria, for fear of destroying the town, reducing his Biju form to merely a fraction of its full size during his short-life scuffle with the armored Titan. Perhaps if he'd used all of his strength back then, mankind wouldn't be in the mess it was now. No. There was nothing he could do about that now. He'd rescued those 2 runts back then, in addition to countless others. He'd done what he could at the time, and now there was nothing to do but live with the consequences of his actions. Best just to watch and see who had the most potential. Stupidity or otherwise. Line 5. About turn. It went on like that for hours, and in that time Mikasa finally realized something. The instructor had ignored her and Eren completely, alongside a handful of other recruits. Perhaps this was because they too had already suffered their rite of passage 3 years ago? He simply glanced at them in passing until finally he came to one Connie Springer. He promptly began to haranguing the young cadet for saluting on the wrong side of his chest. Honestly, who did that? Mikasa almost felt sorry for him. Poor kid. The crunch of a potato being bitten interrupted them. All eyes turned towards the perpetrator, a young brunette lass with dark eyes. She seemed to be scarfing down the potato as if her life depended on it. Perhaps it did, judging by the look on her face. It might have been at least a week since her last meal. Shotties promptly dropped Connie. Everyone froze. Even Mikasa felt just a touch uncomfortable when she recognizes that fearsome gleam in the instructor's eye. Oh, that poor girl. Oi, you there. He growled, approaching the potato girl. What are you doing? In response, the girl glanced around and took another bite. I am fucking talking to you, cadet. Shotties bellowed. Who the fuck do you think you are? As Sasha Browse, sir. I'm from the southern wall Rose village of Dopper, sir. Sasha Browse, what is that thing in your hand? Sir. She said with a salute. It's a potato, sir. I can fucking see that, cadet. The instructor bellowed. Why are you eating it? I saw it in the kitchen and it looked delicious, sir. So, you stole it? Why? Why would you choose to eat it now? Potatoes are much more delicious when they're hot, sir. I thought I should act swiftly. Ho! Is that so? Well, in that case you can run swiftly for the next 3 hours. Era, can't you go easy on her, Shotty-san? A familiar voice drawled somewhere behind and above the line. Poor thing, looks like she's about to drop dead from hunger. The instructor offered a small snort in reply. You're too soft, Naruto. Mikasa bristled. She knew that name. And now, that voice. But it couldn't be. It could possibly be, it was. Her gaze swung upward. There she found him, standing above them all on a slight rise. Naruto laughed as he stepped off from the cliff, his body plummeting like a sinking stone to the canyon floor miles below. Mikasa's breath caught in her throat. Was he insane? That was a 50-foot drop. He'd be killed or worse. She watched, helpless, as her savior dropped towards them feet first, his body standing stiff and rigid, a spear falling down from the heavens, gliding through nothingness as though he'd been born there. And he wasn't even wearing maneuver gear. Surely, such a drop should have spelled his doom. His boots sank into the stone, leaving a slight impression upon the earth as he alighted effortlessly amongst the recruits. His recruits. Everyone made way for him warily, each uncertain of his sudden intrusion, but none dared challenge his presence, this unannounced arrival, not here in the presence of the instructor. He hadn't changed a bit, Mikasa noted. No, perhaps that wasn't entirely true. For starters, it looked like he'd finally taken a bath. Those spiky blonde locks were still mangled and unruly, but at least they weren't caked with grease and grime as they'd been when last they'd met. Naruto appeared rested as well, another stark contrast with the exhausted fighter that had rescued her and Eren all those years ago. He'd since swapped his tattered rags out as well, exchanging those battered garb for that of a military uniform and trench coat, and he looked absolutely at home in both. There was a slight swagger to his step, one that all but screamed it's good to be back. Then there was the gleam in his eyes, one that said these next few years just might prove to be perhaps the most painful days they'd ever endured. And the instructor did nothing to question his presence. If anything, Keith Shotties seemed to welcome it. Hell! That was a slight smile on his face, wasn't it? What was going on here? Naruto-san?
Mikasa exclaimed in disbelief, her eyes staring. Despite herself, despite knowing what the instructor would do, she broke rank and bolted towards him.
Is that you? Is that really you?
For his part, Naruto didn't reprimand her, he simply stared back at her in sheer disbelief. It was only when she grabbed him, when she flung her arms around him, that the shinobi finally reacted. A velvety grunt leapt from his lips, his arms shooting out to catch her by the shoulders, drawing her back as though he were afraid she might somehow attack him despite not having a weapon.
Who the hell are you? He demanded with a growl. Mikasa's heart sank into her throat. He didn't recognize her? Well, that wasn't surprising. Oi, baka!
Eren hissed, but his warning fell on deaf ears.
What are you doing? Get back in line. Mikasa wasn't listening. It's me.
She argued back at the blonde holding her.
Mikasa. What are you talking about? Wait. Blue eyes bulged, recognition dawning in their aquamarine depths. Mikasa? You're that chibi I rescued back in Shiganshina.
He grinned then, and Mikasa felt her heart skip a beat.
I almost didn't recognize you after all these years. You've gotten bigger? How's your brother? Is he around here? Cammy. He was asking too many questions.
And he seemed to realize it too, because he held out a hand to stifle his own mouth.
Wait, never mind that. What the hell are you doing here? Don't tell me you decided to become a soldier because of...
I decided to become a soldier on my own.
Mikasa found herself admitting in a murmur, her body squirming beneath his piercing gaze. I thought that if I did, I might be able to see you again, somehow. Well, that was partially true.
She'd known he was alive for at least a year now, her hoping and praying must have paid off somehow. Tales of a fox slaughtering titans were rather hard to miss, after all. His survival ever since he'd saved her had never been called into question. But to suddenly see him here, standing before her after 3 years, it was almost too much to bear.
Oh, seriously? Those two?
I didn't know they had a relationship like that.
Murmurs erupted around her. Mikasa gave them no thought whatsoever.
She only had eyes for the scarred, smiling blonde standing before her.
Because he was alive. Alive!
Standing here before her unharmed after all these years.
She'd thought him to be dead.
And he hadn't changed in the slightest. Aside from a few new scars on his face and forehead, her savior appeared virtually ageless. He was still 17 going on 18, still the same youth that had saved their lives that fatefully day in the Shiganshina district. Although the age gap had shrunk to 4 years on her end, he hadn't aged a day.
But how was that possible? Seriously, kid?
Naruto was still incredulous, she could see it in his face.
You wanted to see me? A complete stranger? You're not a stranger.
Her cheeks were burning now despite her insistence. Mikasa desperately pushed her boot into the dirt as though she could somehow bury what she felt there.
You are, that is to say, I. Cammy, what was wrong with her? Why was she feeling so flustered? She just wanted to thank him. Right?
If so, then why did she feel this strange pressure in her chest whenever she looked at him?
What was going on here that had her so out of sorts?
Frustrated tears brimmed at the corners of her eyes, increasingly aware of the unwanted attention. You don't need to say anymore. Naruto's calloused hand reached down to ruffle her hair, gently tousing those ebony locks.
Ye were happy to see me, right? I guess that's what's important.
Mikasa's head jerked up in a flash, just in time to catch the slightest of smiles on his whiskered visage before it disappeared entirely.
And then it was gone. But putting that aside, now that you are here, there's something I should say. It was then that the blonde flashed her a grin that looked more at home on a demon than any man. Get back in line, maggot.
Oh, she had the sick-sin feeling she wasn't going to enjoy this.
Not at all. Now get.
As if to confirm her thoughts, the blonde gave Mikasa a harsh and unexpected shove, thrusting her back to her place in line.
Mikasa reluctantly took the hint and stepped back beside her brother.
Ignoring the confused stares of her foster brother and fellow cadets, she directed her gaze back to Naruto's, only now realizing why he'd turned so crass, on a sudden.
Here, Naruto wasn't her savior.
He was her superior officer. And as such, he had an example to set. There could be no favoritism from him. He couldn't afford to be seen doing such things here in front of all these fresh, impressionable faces. But even so, that push had hurt, just a little. His gaze caught hers for the briefest moment, his eyes offering an unspoken apology for his rough treatment.
Then, that too was gone, evaporating in place of a rigid scowl.
The scarred blonde performed a sudden about-face, striding to stand before the recruits.
The instructor, seemingly so rigid and unyielding earlier, now made way for him readily. Naruto took a deep breath and released it in the same instant, his eyelids fluttering shut.
When next they opened, his eyes were cold chips of sapphire.
Listen well, maggots. He began.
Before we begin your training here today, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. Someone who can't sacrifice anything, can never change anything.
Mikasa started in surprise. Where had that come from? But Naruto wasn't finished. Will you throw aside your humanity to confront these monsters? Or will you be trodden underfoot? Will you fight for your life? Will you be willing to toss aside that same life for the comrade standing beside you, for the sake of humankind? Will you throw yourself into battle to your deaths against overwhelming odds? Those who cannot do these things, leave here this instant.
The military is no place for you.
You'd be better off in the landfills.
But for those of you say yes, for those of you who are willing to stay, know this, I will make you strong.
Stronger than you've ever been. Strong enough to slay the Titans. Strong enough to protect humanity.
The blonde let his words ring out amongst the cadets, let them sink in as London as he dared. He was taking a risk here, a massive gamble that might not pay off.
Some of you may recognize me.
He continued, his voice dropping an octave.
Some of you may have heard of me as well.
3 years ago I successfully aided in the evacuation of Wall Maria. But for those of you who do not know this face and have not heard my name, allow me to reintroduce myself.
I am Uzumaki Naruto. A shinobi.
Container of the nine-tailed fox.
Hero of humanity.
A murmur of confusion and uncertainty rippled through the group. Mikasa alone remained unfazed by his flamboyant introduction. But not everyone had her stoic disposition, because someone beside her said something.
Ano, could you repeat that, sir? You there.
Naruto's neck rounded on the perpetrator with such speed that Mikasa thought his head would fly right off his shoulders. The girl on her right squeaked and performed an about-face, pigtails bouncing from the motion. She was a young thing, Mikasa realized, her dark eyes wide and fraught with uncertainty. They grew wider still when Naruto stalked towards them, eyes ablaze. He thrust his visage forward at her, forehead mere inches from her own.
What's your name, cadet? He demanded. Am Mina Carolina, sir. Mina, huh? Naruto mused. And why are you here today, Mina? To give my heart to humanity's cause, sir. And why would humanity want your heart, maggot? Because I choose to give it, sir. Well said.
The blonde seemed to accept that response, drawing back from this dark-haired lass.
It seems you have a strong spirit there. Good. I can use that. How would you like to become a shinobi, Mina? A sudden silence followed those words. Even Mikasa didn't understand his question. What the devil was a shinobi in way?
But, despite her own confusion, she refused to let that uncertainty show. Mina, lacking such resolve, faltered almost immediately.
I am afraid I don't understand the question, sir. What is a shinobi, sir?
Instead of shouting as everyone had expected, the former Jonin's words were quite soft.
Enough with the sir. Naruto waved her words aside. Just call me Naruto. Or better yet, Naruto-sensei.
A wistful look rested at the scowl he wore.
Always wanted someone to call me that.
But to unwear what you've asked me, think of a shinobi as an elite warrior, such as myself. A soldier beyond soldiers, endowed with superhuman strength and speed, able to survive almost anywhere, do almost anything.
I'm only willing to train a handful for now. His next words addressed the entire congregation.
In other words, I will only train 6 of you in total. Those 6 will be forced to undergo hellish training in addition to your soldier training, for the next 3 years. It won't be easy, mind you. To become a shinobi takes great concentration and work ethic, not to mention chakra control.
What is chakra, you ask?
It is mental and physical energy, molded by years of training. Once produced, it can be used to create techniques known to most as jutsu.
Here's an example. Behold.
Naruto crossed his fingers and a plume of smoke surrounded him, blinding all to his presence. When it cleared, he was surrounded by a phalanx of clones, living breathing replicas of himself. A chorus of gasps rose up from the cadets at the unexpected sigh.
What sorcery was this?
Mikasa smiled in awe at the sight. She remembered seeing this before as a child.
Odd.
The idea of learning such a thing actually excited HR.
This is the Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. Naruto addressed the assembled candidates.
It creates living, breathing clones of oneself that transmit memories of their experience once dispelled, a useful technique for scouting and sabotage.
Additionally, Titans cannot tell the difference between you and a clone. Remember this if you don't want to get eaten.
I could always show you my other jutsu, but this'll do for now. Murmurs of approval began to overtake the nervous whispers. Anyone could see the use for such a technique. With a Kage Bunshin, a shinobi could inherently avoid danger altogether, or call upon an ally to aid them in battle. A soldier could use it to distract a titan, providing an opening for the killing blow.
I'll say this again. Naruto barked out, my training, it is not for the weak-hearted. It will be harsh and demanding and you will have little to no time for rest. Some of you may consider it life-threatening. You may even die. However,
if you somehow survive the next 3 years, I can promise you that you will be worth 10, no, 100 of the solidires you see manning our walls today.
Now, those who wish to accept, raise your hand and say hi as I pass you by, and if I deem you capable, I will train you. To everyone's amazement, Mina's hand immediately shot up before Naruto even turned around. Hi. Hi.
The blonde drawled off, smiling.
Hi, Naruto-sensei. Mina replied quickly, never lowering her hand for an instant. I wish to be trained. All right.
Naruto bent before her and placed his palm flat upon her stomach.
Let's see if you have any chakra coils for me to work with. Hold still and take deep easy breaths.
His hand seemed to pulse with an ethereal glow for a long moment as he spoke, eyes darting this way and that beneath his lids, searching.
Mikasa watched intently, waiting to see what would happen. For a long moment, nothing did. Then. There.
Mina doubled over, clutching at her stomach in the same instant that Naruto grunted in triumph. The girl's mouth opened as if to scream, but no sound emerged from her throat. Large eyes scrunched themselves shut in a desperate attempt to block out the agony that had to be consuming her. Just when Mikasa thought Mina was certain to scream her lungs out, Naruto retracted his hand, eyes scrunching shut in unseen pain. And then it was done, leaving him standing and Mina holding her stomach.
Congratulations. Naruto rewarded the exhausted girl with a slight nod.
You've survived the worst of it. I've activated your chakra coils using my own power, so you'll be sore for a few hours.
Nothing a bit of shut-eye and some aspirin won't fix. Now go back to the barracks and rest up. You've got a long 3 years ahead of you, you know? Thank you, sir. She gasped out.
At Naruto's order, a soldier led her away to her bunk, careful to keep the obviously winded lass from exhausting herself even further. Naruto watched his first disciple go with only the slightest shake of his head.
Gonna have to work on that enthusiasm.
The deadpan was barely concealed.
Anywho, moving on.
Mikasa thought she caught a twinkle in the blonde's eyes as he crossed onto the next line to begin his inspection of the recruits.
Perhaps it was just her imagination.
Several raised their hands. Several were inspected. Nearly all of them were dismissed on the spot. And with each dismissal, Mikasa felt her chances dwindle.
What was Naruto looking for? He seemed to be inspecting each cadet's stomach for some reason. Was that where these coils of theirs were supposed to be? Did Mina have something she didn't then? She could only wonder.
A lifetime seemed to pass as Naruto painstakingly inspected each recruit, growing more and more disgusted with each and every failure. The sole exception to that was a boy named Jean Kirstein. He'd struck Mikasa as a laid-back sort, but his volunteering had shocked her.
Hadn't he wanted to join the military police? He'd received a headbutt from their instructor for that laid-back attitude. What had inspired him to raise his hand then?
Unlike the others, he did not fall. Nor did he scream. He didn't even writhe in utter agony as the 5 failures before him had. He did curse, however.
Fuck! Fuck!
The boy yelped as Naruto unsheathed his arm from his stomach, doubling over with a groan.
You didn't say it would hurt this much. I didn't say it wouldn't hurt, now did I, maggot? No, but... Bam!
Everyone flinched as the blonde ruthlessly headbutted him.
Would you like another, boy?
Naruto challenged as the loudmouth lad sank to his knees and clutched at his head. Jean was wise enough not to reply to that, much to Naruto's amusement. He might have some potential after all. Despite the boy's obvious mouth and temper, he felt genuinely heartened for the first time in at least a year.
Maybe there were more would-be shinobi hiding amidst these rejects after all.
With that thought in mind, he sent Jean off to rest with Mina for the duration of the afternoon, confident he'd have the 4 remaining shinobi he sought before nightfall. 4 more failures swiftly disabused him of that notion.
For fuck's sake. Kurama growled. All these recruits, and only 2 of them have semi-decent chakra coils?
And even then, you had to flood them with your chakra just to get them working.
What the hell happened to this future? I hear ya.
Something must have gone wrong in this time. Jean and Mina might be great something or other descendants from shinobi, probably why they had the coils in the first place.
But the others, nothing. Failures, all around. Damn, just how far into the future had they been flung? Looks like you'll have more soldiers than I will shinobi, Shari-san. Naruto remarked at the instructor.
Don't get me wrong, you've got some fine material here, but these kids are meant to be soldiers.
Not shinobi by any means. Was it Mikasa's imagination, or did Naruto's gaze seem to stray towards Reiner Braun as he said this? It must have been, because the stoic recruit didn't so much as bat an eyelash.
Naruto grunted and once more resumed his exhaustive check of the recruits who had volunteered.
And then finally. He approached them.
He stopped before Eren, despite the fact that Mikasa's brother hadn't raised his hand.
He was quick to point that out, too. No thank you, sir. Not interested, Eren? Naruto seemed slightly amused by the boy's obvious defiance. Sir, no sir. Jiger shook his head emphatically. I will be fine, sir. Such a shame. Naruto sighed. I can tell by looking at you, you have the right chakra coils. Alright, then. Have it your way. I guess that's about it for this line dash. Mikasa's hand shot up. Mikasa? Naruto and Eren finally had something in common. They both thought she was bat's head crazy. Are you insane? Eren bit out. You saw what it did to the others. You might die. Mikasa ignored her brother. Naruto-san, I would like to take the training. She forced her voice to be level, despite the ever-growing pit of fear in her stomach.
The man she had come to know as her savior and now her superior stared at her for a long moment, then he raised his hand and clenched the wrist of that hand in a vicious vice. One by one the fingers of that hand began to glow, seemingly pulsating with tongues of fire, azure flames licking at the tips of each digit. Mikasa forced herself to swallow. Naruto had been quite clear in his instruction, this could kill the unprepared. I might die from this, she realized. I'm going to flood your circulatory system with most of my chakra. He explained. It's going to hurt. A lot. This is your last chance to back out now, while you still can. Huh? Why was he explaining this to her and not the others? Did he actually care about what happened to her? The thought made her flush. You don't have to do this. He said one last time. Yes, she whispered softly, I do. Because I want to be like you. She added silently. Then clench your teeth. Without warning he thrust his clawed fingers into her stomach and twisted the skin there, plunging his hand impossibly deep. Hard. Oh my god, Kami. Mikasa's mouth snapped shut, her tongue screwing against the roof of her mouth as a wave of red-hot lava that came coursing through her veins. What pain! It felt as if every inch of her were afire. How had Mina been able to keep silent through this? More importantly, how would she? She didn't want to show any weakness. But it hurt. Kami. It hurt so much. Losing her mother was almost nothing compared to this. She could feel the energy Naruto had spoken of surging up inside of her, burgeoning within her, strengthening her, flooding her with warmth. She tried to focus on that strength, that warmth, desperate to ignore the everlasting agony so intent upon destroying her body from within, and God, she was going to die. Naruto yanked his arm back with a hiss of disgust, leaving her to slump forward, gasping for breath. Mikasa didn't understand. Her entire body was slick with sweat and her throat was hoarse, confirming that she had indeed been screaming. No. This didn't make any sense. What had she done wrong? Why was she still in so much pain? Kit. I know. Naruto replied. Damn it, I can't believe she got your chakra instead of mine, we could have killed her. Look on the bright side, if she survives tonight, she'll come out stronger for it. Stronger than any shinobi you could have created. That's not the point, Bakuman. I'm trying to restart my race. Not kill innocent children. Give her 3 years, she won't be a child then, she'll make a fine mate by then. You Rusi. Keep a handle on your chakra from now on. Hi, whatever you say. Unaware of the internal argument raging inside the blonde's skull, Mikasa clawed herself onto her hands and knees. Gradually, the feeling began to return to her arms and legs, leaving her awash in a sea of stiff, sore muscles and bruised bones. Had Naruto's chakra really damaged her this much? It didn't seem possible. Try not to move so much. Naruto warned. You've had a rough time of it. I'm fine. She insisted. Naruto's eyes widened a bit, but he did not contest her decision. Very well. He said shortly. Get some sleep when you can. I'll see you tonight. Without another word he turned his back on her and moved on down the line. Somehow, his silence stung more than anything. She watched him move on to the next volunteer and wondered why she had been the one to suffer under his chakra so much. All the while she pondered over it. Might I give it a try, sir? You sure about that, potato girl? It's gonna hurt. Naruto turned to regard Sasha over his shoulder, an almost predatory gleam in his eye. She'd fallen silent ever since he'd prevented her punished at the hands of shotties, but now that she'd finally finished savoring her stolen snack, she appeared to have mustered up her courage. The only question was, would it last? There was only one way to find out. Sheathing his hand in chakra, he started forward, advancing at a relentless pace meant to frighten and intimidate. He had to be certain she wasn't a coward before he did anything. I'll endure it.
Sasha gulped nervously. So be it.
Naruto stepped forward and thrust his hand into her stomach.
Itai. Sasha yelped and promptly fell over like, well, a sack of potatoes. Krista gasped. Is she?
Nah, Naruto drawled, nudging her with the toe of his boot.
She'll be just fine.
I only gave her a short jolt as a precaution. Wait till nightfall, she'll be up and running with the rest of you.
Let's see then, that makes 4 of you now.
3 girls, and only 1 guy.
Sheesh. She could see his narrow blue eyes sweeping over the recruits, the sudden lack of volunteers after Mikasa's near-death experiences. TCH. I still have 2 more spots left and no one left to fill them. Isn't anyone willing to try this? Are you all a bunch of cowards?
Slowly, tentatively, Krista raised her hand.
Hi. Beside her, Emer arched an eyebrow. Oi, are you serious?
Krista didn't have time to reply to her comrade, because Naruto was suddenly there, towering over her, casting her body into shadow.
Blazing blue eyes bored into her this slight, quivering girl standing beneath him in defiance of his disbelief.
His face was expressionless, giving no hint whatsoever as to the pride swelling in his chest. He didn't even bother to touch her as he'd done to others. Instead, his scouring gaze raked across her like hot coals before finally narrowing upon her stomach.
Not bad, he admitted, patting her upon the head. You've got some nice coils. This shouldn't hurt too much.
He pushed a single finger into her stomach. Krista felt a slight twinge and then it was done. Just like that, the last shinobi stepped back from her, only now she could see the pride in his eyes.
Get back to the barracks, cadet. He huffed gruffly. I've got high hopes for you.
Naruto stepped past them without another word.
Are you serious right now? Emer was hissing at Krista as he left them behind. That coulda killed you. I feel fine. Like hell you do. Looks like the tall one has feelings for the short one. Kurama cackled. This should be interesting. Indeed.
Naruto made no mention of the strange scent coming from Emer. It was the same reason he hadn't bothered to inspect her for chakra coils.
He had the sixth feeling she didn't have any. But putting that aside, he was already almost completely out potential recruits. That Armin lad might be promising, but he looked weak. Decisions. And you are?
He asked, halting just before the last members of the recruits in line. Inexplicably, he was drawn to one in particular. Cold eyes gazed up at him beneath slightly coiffed flaxen hair, reflecting what most might have mistaken for boredom. She looked to be just around the same age as Mikasa and the others, but her eyes suggested she was in fact much older.
Interesting. She was probably in her late teens already. What could possibly motivate her to become a soldier now? And then there was that faint scent lingering around her, just like Emer's. Your name? He repeated firmly. Annie Leonhardt. She replied at last. Not much enthusiasm there. Naruto noted. How are you going to face the Titans like that? I could ask you the same thing.
Her words were soft, almost lacking in emotion, but even a fool could have sensed the challenge in them. All you've done so far is show us a few cheap parlor tricks and poke or punch all of us in the stomach.
There was a silence, hanging over their heads like a guillotine, ready to drop. You insolent piece of dash. Shadi's face looked like it was about to burst open out from anger, but remarkably, Naruto didn't snap at Annie. But what he did next shocked everyone. Instead of exploding into anger as they expected him to, the blonde merely frowned and leaned forward, placing his hand on the back of Annie's head to steady her. Hold her in place. Oh, crap. Connie hissed. She's dead. But Annie was not dead, because the blonde didn't touch her after the fact. Naruto inhaled slowly, drinking deep of her scent, breathing in then out. Once, twice. 3 times he did this, much to Annie's consternation.
Then his eyes narrowed suddenly at her, sapphire orbs becoming more akin to winter ice than the brighty afternoon skies for which they were so well known.
Cheap tricks, eh?
His words were deadly soft now, meant only for himself and the girl whose head he was clutching in his hand.
That's big talk, coming from a Titan shifter.
To her credit, Annie concealed her reaction well, her body stiffened only slightly. But in the end, it was her eyes that gave her away. Those crystal blue orbs bulged so large she was almost certain they were going to fall right out of her head.
He knew.
She didn't know how, but someway he knew that she could shift into a Titan.
You. Relax, Naruto soothed, placing his free hand upon Annie's shoulder, locking her in place. It's not like I plan on telling anyone. Besides, you haven't done anything wrong. Yet.
Then again, he mused, his grip growing tighter upon her scalp, if you're planning on starting something, I could always just crush your pretty little head right here, right now.
No one would question my actions.
Hell, if anything, I'd save myself a world of worry about your motives, plans, whatever it is you seem to be up to.
Should I do that, I wonder? Kill you now and spare myself the trouble, or take you under my wing and see how you turn out? Mikasa couldn't help but wonder, what were the two of them talking about? Whatever it was, Naruto's words seemed to have taken a toll on his fellow blonde. She was an absolute mess. Annie couldn't bring herself to think or to focus, she could barely even breathe.
Her mind was racing, scrabbling for thought, clamoring for a conclusion.
The jig was up. He knew. She didn't know how, but somehow, this guy knew. And what was this about him being a Titan shifter? Was he bluffing? Maybe. But that didn't matter, not now.
She couldn't decide whether to shift into her Titan form and flee or simply stay put and play dumb hoping to bluff her way out of this situation.
No. It was too risky. This Naruto character was too shrewd. If she tried to lie her way out of this, she'd likely lose her life. Even now, she was all too aware of those fingers digging into her skull. If she tried anything he'd crush her head without so much as a second thought. Indeed, could probably kill her on a whim. That he hadn't done so yet that she still drew breath was for reasons unknown. Just, what did he want with her? More importantly, how much did he know? Did he know about? Oi, Shadi-san.
Naruto spoke up suddenly, causing Annie to flinch, jarring her train of thought from its tracks. I'll be borrowing this one for a bit.
Keep the recruits here until I get back. Before either student or even the instructor could hope to protest, the shinobi took his hand from Annie's shoulder and did something with his fingers. She didn't get a very good look at what he was doing, but whatever it was caused the ground to lurch beneath her feet. Everything began to blur, leaving her eyes darting frantically back and forth in her head, then blackness. Annie woke to find herself bound and gagged. Warm sunlight filtered down onto her face, a single shaft of brilliance stabbing into her left eye. With a start, she remembered what had happened. That blonde bastard. She lurched upright with a start, gasping against the rag in her mouth, wincing as cold iron bit into her wrist. It was then that she realized her arms were shackled behind her back. Damn it. She couldn't shift if she was unable to inflict some sort of wound upon herself to begin with. Naruto must have known this and planned accordingly. Speaking of which, where the devil was he? Well, that was quick. A cold shiver shot down the blonde's spine. Just now, she could have sworn she felt killer intent. I'm surprised. Naruto called out yet again, his voice echoing somewhere out of sight. You were only out for about 15 minutes there. Titan shifters really are scary. Annie muttered a curse through the gag. She stood with wooden legs, not taking enough care for herself or her body, sparing only a precursory glance for her surroundings. What she saw caused her heart to plummet into her stomach. Trees stretched around her for miles on end, blotting out the afternoon sun, presenting no easy means of escape. Escape. Ha! Even had she known how to utilize the 3D maneuver gear and she wouldn't have known which way to go.
And if she tried to flee as she was, she'd probably be picked off before she even made it out of the forest.
Have you calmed down now?
Annie swung around, gasping as Naruto emerged from the bark of a nearby tree. He simply stepped out of it as though he'd always been there, the wood rippling before his passing. Just what the hell was he? In the time it took for her to wonder it aloud, he was already standing before her.
Welcome to the forest of giant trees.
The blonde replied by way of greeting, indicating their surroundings with a broad sweep of his arm.
I've got my Hiraishin seals plastered all over this forest, and since they never fade, it's sort of become my own personal killing ground. Killing ground? Oh no. Oh no no no. No. He'd brought her out here to be butchered, then. That was why she was bound.
So, she couldn't escape. Yet again, the overwhelming sensation of fear crashed down on Annie, rooting her where she stood.
The slightest of smiles plucked at his lips. Could he sense her fear? Which reminds me, I wouldn't go down there if I were you.
He pointed towards the forest floor and a small flame ignited upon his fingertip, its light revealing a mass of writhing shapes just below their feet. Despite herself, Annie blanched.
Here in the light of Naruto's candle, she could see shapes. Grotesque, monstrous shapes, trying to climb up and eat them. Titans.
There had to be hundreds of them. Despite the knowledge that they were safe up here for the time being, she shivered at the sight of them.
For some reason, I'm catnip to these guys. Naruto explained. They're always trying to devour me. Maybe it has something to do with my chakra. Annie refused to dignify that with a response. Silent treatment, eh? He laughed at her defiance. Fine then. You just sit there. I'll do the talking. You remind me of himself when I was younger. Naruto continued, confiding in her with a glance. Back then I was all alone, too. Although I wasn't exactly as cold as you. He whistled at her glare. Ooh, scary. There's no need to make such a face. I just want to talk, that's all. He patted the bough beside him, indicating that he wanted her to sit. Reluctantly, Annie complied. But that didn't mean she had to like it. Stubbornly she sat as far as she possibly could from him, refusing to look her captor in the eye. If he expected to get information for her, he had another thing coming. Would you feel better if I let you transform? Her fellow blonde offered. If I made you fight me? Would you think about using your powers for the good of mankind, then? Annie's head snapped towards Naruto's like a puppet severed from its strings. What on earth was he saying? Use her powers for the good of mankind? When she had a mission to complete? Well. He prodded her verbally. Is that a yes or no? Her only reply was a grunt. Did he really expect her to answer with this gag on? If I remove that, will you try to escape? She shook her head slowly. Of course, she'd try to escape. But not just yet. Here. He reached around her head and untied the ragcloth. Don't make me chop off your arms while I'm at it. Clever bastard. She daren't transform without her arms, he'd have her pinned in an instant. Biting back a vitriolic retort, the blonde silently resolved herself to wait for her best opportunity. Now that he'd ungagged her, she had a chance to pry him for information. That information might aid her in her mission. And what better way to probe him for information than to attack his weakest area, the one thing she, as a fellow shifter, knew that he hated beyond anything else? You're a shifter as well. She said. Like me. Of course. Naruto tilted his head in continuance. I may hate shifting, but I find it helps my self-control if I have a clear goal in mind. For example, my goal today would be to stopping you from throwing your life away fruitlessly, because that's exactly what you'll be doing if I let you go down there right now. Annie hated to admit it, but he had a point there. Even if she ran away from here at top speed, she'd eventually tire, and once she did, they'd be on her almost immediately, but she wasn't about to admit that to him. You're so kind.
The venom in her voice could have peeled rust off steel.
Is that what you think I am? Annie blinked and he was gone, then something or someone grabbed her by the face, knocking her body sideways into the bough.
Stars spangled before her vision as that someone held her off the branch and dangled her down, leaving her hanging over the blackness.
I am not kind.
Naruto hissed into her ear, his voice blacker than any pit, bleaker than even the scene below them.
I'm not even all that nice.
I've seen things you can't possibly imagine, done things that would make your blood curdle in your veins.
My body count is higher than the walls themselves. What's one more body on that conscience, huh?
The reason I'm cutting you some slack here, the only reason, is because I know what it feels like to happen to be all alone, to do something you'd rather not.
Don't make me regret that decision, girl. I could drop you right now and not lose a wink of sleep over it. In fact.
Abruptly, he released her head. Annie barely had time to blink before she dropped towards the forced floor, towards the awaiting titans. Despite knowing she could transform, her mind was inexplicably frozen, filled with fear at the sight of those gaping maws filled with row upon row of slavering teeth.
Oto!
Naruto reached down and calmly grabbed her by the nape of the neck just before she could fall into range of the arms.
Can't have you dying on me just yet.
Exhaling in a long-suffering sigh, he hauled her back onto the branch and tossed her over his shoulder. Annie landed with a pained grunt, her ass bouncing off the branch, her chest hitching in a soft gasp as she realized she was still alive.
You, insufferable bastard. She sobbed. What if you hadn't caught me in time? Naruto laughed at her.
Then I would have transformed and come to your rescue.
But, I think I've taken a liking to you.
He drawled aloud, his ever-present grin widening marginally as she glanced in his direction.
That settles it. I've decided. Annie Leonhardt. You'll be my disciple.
With a grin that looked more devilish than anything she'd seen in her life, Naruto reached down for her. His hand muffled her hair, surprising in his affections. This was her chance to escape. His guard was down. If she transformed now and attacked him, if she ran at full speed, she might just stand a chance of making it out of here alive.
Wait. He was probably expecting that.
She'd witnessed his speed firsthand. She'd be a fool to go against such power without preparing herself accordingly. No, she would wait for her chance to strike at him. To strike at this insufferably cruel, unbelievably handsome bastard.
I have to stop thinking like that. If looks could kill. Naruto seemed to consider her for a moment. Again, with that scary look.
Just for that, I think I'll show you something special. He made a motion with his left hand and a clone materialized behind Annie in a plume of smoke. Within an instant it had her, seizing her arms and wrists her before she could think to escape. Hold still. It sighed, taking hold of her other shoulder.
This'll only take a minute.
She was forced to look on, helpless, as Naruto summoned still more clones and sent them down into the mass of writhing titans miles below their feet. Each doppelganger clutched a massive sphere of swirling wind in their hand, the design almost vaguely reminiscent of a giant shuriken. Before Annie could wonder at its purpose or its intent, a massive explosion greeted her ears.
Body parts flew in every direction as the raisin shurikens detonated. He killed them all, hundreds of them, in only an instant. There we go. Naruto stared down at the smoldering crater he'd left behind, pleased by his handiwork. I do so love it when a plan comes together. Now I'll have a chance to show you it in relative peace.
Even as he said this, the clone tightened its grip on her shoulders, just before the original launched himself off the bough. The clone leapt after him, dragging Annie with it. Almost immediately thereafter they were fallowing, the three of them plummeting down into the darkness towards the forest floor at a breakneck pace, leaving Annie's eyes to water as they streaked through the black. She knew what he was going to show her, or at least she had an idea of what it might be, and it terrified her. Here we are. The shinobi clapped his hands twice as they alighted upon the forest floor, igniting a small light over their heads. Another of his jutsu, no doubt. Watch closely now.
Naruto cautioned, raising a hand to his mouth. You'll only see this for a second. With that, he bit down. Hard. What? The land burst as a lightning bolt descended from the heavens, shearing through the trees to strike him, shearing through the forest, sending her vision topsy-turvy. Steam erupted between the two of them, threatening to scald her from head to toe. When something strode out from that cloud of steaming smoke, she felt her lungs drop into the pit of her stomach and she was literally unable to catch her breath. Naruto peered down and grinned at her, exposing row upon row of deadly teeth in this massive new form. Annie began to quiver at the sight of it. This titan, it could barely even be called such. But that's not possible. Hours later. Mikasa glanced up sharply as a swirl of leaves announced Naruto and Annie's return, their unannounced arrival nearly causing her to fall from the wires that kept her suspended. It was a crucial part of their maneuvered gear training, and she was determined to master it. Others lost their concentration at the blonde's unannounced arrival, flopping face-first into the unyielding earth at their feet. Mikasa alone managed to preserve her bodily balance, just barely. Annie looked visibly shaken, as though her mind had been through a blender and back. She was trembling, eyes slightly wide, her knees all but knocking together. Mikasa had no way of knowing that this blonde alone had borne witness to Naruto's titan form. She didn't even know her savior had such a form. Annie did. She'd thought herself ready for it, but the mere sight of that thing had left her absolutely terrified. Not that she'd ever admit it, but to know something that large could move so fast and strike with that much power, it brought a frightening level of realism to her mission. If she ever tried to accomplish her task, Naruto would double-tossly stand in her way. And he would kill her. She knew that now, were she ever to try and face him in her titan form, she'd have to be well prepared. Because if she wasn't, she would die, just as all those titans had died. Did I frighten you? Naruto was saying as they drew within earshot, causing Mikasa to cock her head aside. You mentioned you could shift into something else. His fellow blonde grumbled back. When Naruto jerked backwards and laughed, no one expected him to do so. It was a deep, throaty sound that garnered everyone's attention and left them simultaneous shivering. Despite that, the blonde had never felt better. Now was as good a time as any to get that elephant out of the room, and it would also serve to help keep Annie in line, for the time being at least. Shall we? We shall. Why, I'm so glad you asked, Annie. A slow, sinister smile spread across the whiskered visage of her fellow blonde. Allow me to show you. Suddenly and without warning, Naruto leapt long and high. His sudden lurch launched him into the air, leaving him hanging overhead. For what felt like an eternity, he simply hovered there over their heads. Then, with a roar that could put the colossal titan to shame, he sank both in scissors deep into his right hand. This time, he didn't bother to hold back. Kurama's chakra surged through him like a tidal wave, swirling around him in an opaque sphere of sapphire and scarlet. His body was changing, morphing, even as gravity began to assert its hold. By the time his paws hit the ground, his body no longer that of a mere man, but of a magnificent golden fox. It towered over them with a snarl, its feet gripping the outer edge of the courtyard, 9 tails lashing at the air like a series of whips. Someone screamed, but a harsh hiss from Naruto from the monster he had become swiftly silenced it. There you have it. The fox growled down at them. Is that answer enough for you, cadet? Numbed, Annie nodded. She hadn't been expecting this. It had all happened so swiftly. Naruto had transformed into the kitsune in the blink of an eye. Mikasa gawped up at it, realized just how much larger the beast was compared to the fierce creature she'd seen 3 years ago to this day. She felt a snake of dread coil into her stomach, peering up at it was almost too much to bear. The damned thing was larger than a mountain. Had he been holding back all those years ago? Surely, he must have, because there was no explanation for the immense discrepancy in his size from then to now. There you go. Naruto's deep rumble vanished in mid-sentence, his great fox form dissolving into the afternoon sky in a pillar of light. I think that's enough of a demonstration for one day. Now, dismissed. Return to your activities. Fine.
Naruto watched her go and warred with himself, fighting a smile. He was taking a gamble with Annie. Not just with his life, but that of humanity. He knew this. Common sense demanded that he eradicate her here and now before she became a threat, and yet, he just couldn't bring himself to do that. He'd been bluffing back there when he'd said he would drop her. To kill an innocent 16-year-old girl even if it meant protecting humanity, he simply didn't have it in him. He wasn't a cold-blooded killer. Not anymore. You're overthinking things. Kurama interjected. Let's just wait 3 years and see what happens. You think I can get her to join our side? She'd make one hell of a ally. Kit, if it's you we're talking about here, you could probably get her to scale the wall with her bare hands. Thanks for the vote of confidence. No problem. The kitsune retorted. After all, in 3 years, these girls will be fair game for us OW. What did you hit me for? For being a fool. Says the fool himself. Naruto's lips quirked in a slight smile at that. Kurama had a point there. He wasn't God. Or the devil. Or even a monster. It wasn't for him to decide these things. Not for him to determine the fate of these cadets, what they said, what they did, what paths they might take once leaving the military. It was all theirs to decide. He could only hope to prepare them as best he could, can come what may. Yes, that's right, he thought to himself. After all, I'm only human. That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfiction. Looking forward to having you on board again.